Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Federalist Files. We're going to be going over Federalist number 26 today. It is titled The Idea of Restraining the Legislative Authority in Regard to the Common Defense Considered. It is written by Alexander Hamilton, December 22nd, 1787. Topics include a defense of standing military to quell insurrections. It'll take time and collusion to create an oppressive military, and finally the militia as an auxiliary in national defense. So Hamilton, this paper is mostly about the legislative authority to keep up troops. In the Articles of Confederation at this time, I don't know if it wasn't the Articles of Confederation, but it was individual state constitutions called for the legislative authority to keep the troops up, not as it relates to the purse, but rather you would have to push it through the legislative authority to even have spending on keeping up the troops and maintaining them and training them and regulating them, which was really nonsensical because there was already the safeguard of the legislature holding the purse to fund the military. Thus, it really does hold the regulation of the military already. It was kind of just an extra supplemental restraint on the legislative authority, which is kind of weird. So that's what Hamilton, what he does is he differentiates that between that and the federal constitution, and then he explains why, and then he also explains why his dissenters feel the way in which they do. So Hamilton opens this paper, and I quote, "It was a thing hardly to be expected that in a popular revolution the minds of men should stop at that happy mean which marks the salutary boundary between power and privilege and combines the energy of government with the security of private rights." End quote. So he's saying here is pretty much he's getting into the introductory that we have people that are afraid of our military power, and it's hard to expect it considering the revolution that we had, that we're going to have people now that are afraid of securing their own private rights, because that's the reason for having the military, having a judicial system, having a government apparatus, the three branches. Having it is also not only to provide security and a robust military, and just putting a real actual solid name on the country and a representation of that country by instilling a government like that, but as well as it secures the private rights of individual citizens. It secures the right to property, right to life for the citizenry. So Hamilton believed that there were fundamental flaws in the balance of power in the current system, and if not fixed, this would continuously follow an erroneous change after change. He states, and I quote, "The idea of restraining the legislative authority in the means of providing for the national defense is one of those refinements which owe their origin to the zeal for liberty more ardent than enlightened." End quote. So meaning the reason that people want to restrain the legislative authority as it relates to the national defense, as it relates to in the regulating of troops, is because they have a zeal or an enthusiasm for liberty that is more ardent or more passionate than enlightenment of ideas or awareness or self-awareness of what is actually going on. So people actually have more enthusiasm for liberty than their free thought at this time. So next he states, and I quote, "The opponents of the proposed Constitution combat in this respect the general decision of America, and instead of being taught by experience the propriety of correcting any extremes into which we may have heretofore run, they appear disposed to conduct us into others still more dangerous and more extravagant, as if the tone of government had been found too high or too rigid. The doctrines they teach are calculated to induce us to depress or to relax it by expedients which upon other occasions have been condemned or forborne." End quote. So this is a long one. It goes pretty in depth here. What he's alluding to here is he's saying we have these people that the point the point making very broad statements, and the point in our proposed constitution giving actual these powers to the government is it's much easier to take these powers away from the government in a system like ours where it is self-government. If we believe the legislative authority has too much power, it's very easy to take the power away from the legislative authority because it is a self-government system, rather than create a system that there is no legislative authority. Then it's actually more difficult to add to that authority. You would need much more vigor, much more alacrity, enthusiasm for it. I think that's what he's trying to allude to here. And then on top of that, he's saying these people, that the objectors right now, they're saying the government's found too high, too rigid, has too much power, and what they want to do is they want to depress the power of the government. And on other occasions, if you look through history, these arguments coming from the dissenters have been condemned and forborne. So the things that the dissenters are calling for have been found ineffective, as well as it ends up leading to anarchy. So then, that being said, this paper confronts critics of the provision that calls for the legislature to appropriate funds for the common defense. Hamilton believed that the legislature was representative of the people at large and can be trusted with this responsibility. So that's the difference between Hamilton and the dissenters. The dissenters didn't even trust the representatives that were supposed to be elected straight from the people and were supposed to represent the people at large, whereas Hamilton believed that since they were representative of the people, they would be responsible enough in their duty to follow through with what needs to be done. So, and then he goes on to state, and I quote, "It may be affirmed without the imputation of invective that if the principles they inculcate on various points could so far obtain as to become the popular creed, they would utterly unfit the people of this country for any species of government whatever. But a danger of this kind is not to be apprehended. The citizens of America have too much discernment to be argued into anarchy, and I am much mistaken if experience has not wrought a deep and solemn conviction in the public mind that greater energy of government is essential to the welfare and prosperity of the community." End quote. So what he's really saying is these principles that they're calling for, they will be unsuccessful. You're trying to instill fear in people. It's not going to happen because the people of America have too much discernment. And then I think he goes on to continue somewhere in here where he talks about where it came from, the origin of this behavior towards no type of legislative authority or very little power from the legislative branch. But he continues here. And pretty much what he says is, he says people are smart enough to realize that we need this proposed constitution because it's essential to the welfare and prosperity of the community and the safety of the citizenry. So then he goes on to state, and I quote, "It may not be amiss in this place concisely to remark the origin and the progress of the idea which aims at the exclusion of military establishments in time of peace, though in speculative minds it may arise from a contemplation of the nature and tendency of such institutions fortified by the events that have happened in other ages and countries, yet as a national sentiment it must be traced to those habits of thinking which we derive from the nation from whom the inhabitants of these states have in general sprung." End quote. So he's saying from experience from which the individuals of this country, the citizenry of this country, of America at this time, a lot of them derived from Europe, derived from Great Britain, where they saw a monarchical or authoritarian structure where the military was far too powerful and it was fortified to the point where there was oppression coming from the military being used as a proxy to the power of the monarch or the king or queen or what have you at that time. And that's really why they're aiming towards this exclusion of military establishments in time of peace, for that reason, because they were afraid based on where they came from, their origination. So then Hamilton, he outlines and this is important. This is where he goes kind of into the history of it. Now, Hamilton outlines the power of the throne in Great Britain with full military establishment authority at the discretion of one monarch and no legislative power to mitigate its actions. He states, and I quote, "In England, for a long time after the Norman conquest, the authority of the monarch was almost unlimited. Inroads were gradually made upon the prerogative in favor of liberty, first by the barons and afterwards by the people, till the greatest part of its most formidable pretensions became extinct." End quote. So here he's talking about the Norman conquest, these inroads to have this unlimited power and this monarch with this unlimited military power and overreach. At first, it was barons tried to fight it for liberty, and afterwards the people tried to fight it, and eventually this monarchical structure, this unlimited powerful military structure, became extinct. And he's going to explain this, and I'll explain it right after this quote, the whole history of everything. So then he states, and I quote, "But it was not till the Revolution of 1688, which elevated the Prince of Orange to the throne of Great Britain, that English liberty was completely triumphant, as incident to the undefined power of making war, an acknowledged prerogative of the crown. Charles II had by his own authority kept on foot in time of peace a body of 5,000 regular troops, and his number, James II, increased to 30,000, who were paid out of his civil list at the Revolution to abolish the exercise of so dangerous an authority. It became an article of the Bill of Rights then framed that the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless with the consent of Parliament, was against the law." End quote. So there's a lot to go through there. So what we have is he mentions Charles II. So he is the predecessor of James II. So you had a glorious revolution. It was the Revolution of 1688, where James II, who happened to be, and I've explained this before, he was technically the monarch or the king of both England and Scotland. So he was considered James II in England, but in Scotland he's considered James VII because he was the seventh James to be the king over there, because they had this weird structure and system. He was replaced by his daughter Mary II and William III of Orange. So that's where he goes into talking about the Prince of Orange, which elevated to the throne. The English liberty was completely triumphant. And there's a lot, and before him was Charles. That was that mention of Charles II. Was before him. They're saying, Charles II had 5,000 standing army, and then, James actually increased it. James II increased it to 30,000. And it was all paid through a civil list, as in it was paid through taxation. So I can only imagine what that did to the pocket of the citizenry over in Great Britain, or in England at this time. And then there's all these really weird, very kind of interesting, there's all these fights that were going on at this time. There's one in France, I think it was, what's that guy's name? Let me see if I can find it. Louis the 14th of France was getting ready for the 9-year war against the Dutch Republic and the stateholder and all. And we've talked about all of this. It kind of gets confusing because there's so many different countries in Europe, and the span of time is so long. Like when he mentioned here the Norman conquest. When I looked up the Norman conquest, it was in like 1063. That was the year, which is 1,000. At this point, it's 700 years ago. And now it's at 1,000 years ago. He's talking about things that happened a very long time ago. So what we have is, he talks, and then what was interesting about James II is he had one daughter that happened to be Protestant, and then one was Catholic, and I don't really understand how all that was possible. And then eventually, when this revolution happened, they took him out of power, and that is when they put that other gentleman in there. And then that's when there was a parliamentary system, and there was a lot more fairness in the system. It wasn't just a monarch that had all of the power. It was a much more intelligently devised system where the powers of the government were more equally distributed. Really, that's what they're trying to allude to here. Say William III of Orange. So that was the leader after all of this was said and done. So what I have next is, let me see. Oh yeah, and then he says and then they put in that provision, unless with the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless with the consent of Parliament. So that became a law, and that's where his dissenters are. That's where their argument is derived from that law in particular, that unless with consent of Parliament was against the law. So then he continues, and I quote, "In that kingdom, when the pulse of liberty was at its highest pitch, no security against the danger of standing armies was thought requisite beyond a prohibition of their being raised or kept up by the mere authority of the executive magistrate. The patriots who effected that memorable revolution were too temperate, too well informed to think of any restraint on the legislative discretion." So, after all this happened, after there was an overthrowing of this monarch, they created a new government structure, government apparatus. Even those patriots, those revolutionaries, they were too well informed, too intelligent to actually even restrain the legislative discretion. They didn't even like the idea of doing that. So they still liked the idea of a standing army, even though they had to fight one themselves. They did not want to restrict or restrain the legislative discretion. And then what we got is, next he states, and I quote, "From the same source, the people of America may be said to have derived a hereditary impression of danger to liberty from standing armies in time of peace. The circumstances of a revolution quickened the public sensibility on every point connected with the security of popular rights, and in some instances raised the warmth of our zeal beyond the degree which consisted with the due temperate of the body politic." So this is where he's actually going to get into politics, and it is very interesting the way in which this works, and that's why there is multiple party system, and it is very significant, and it's worth pointing out. It's critical. So then he goes on. So in this one, what he said is, maybe these ideas, these objectors, are derived from the hereditary impression, danger of liberty, and what we have here is, in some instances, you raise the warmth. They felt that their enthusiasm was raised to a certain degree, according to the body politic, and I'll explain that in a second. So he continues, and I quote, "The attempts of two of the states to restrict the authority of the legislature in the article of military establishments are of the number of these instances. The principles which had taught us to be jealous of the power of a hereditary monarch were by an injudicious excess extended to the representatives of the people in their popular assemblies." End quote. So the reason, and this is all about the politics that he's talking about, is political groups, political bodies, they will cause you to maybe be jealous or think a certain way because of this. And that's what he's alluding to. They will inflame or exacerbate the feeling against the idea of a standing military, and I think that's what he's really trying to get at here. And the principle that taught us to be jealous of the power of a hereditary monarch was overextended. It was over-exaggerated, and it should not be. We should not fear our representatives, the representatives of the people, the House of Reps, because they're supposed to directly represent us, the citizenry. So then he goes on, and he states, and I quote, "Even in some of the states where this error was not adopted, we find unnecessary declarations that standing armies ought not to be kept up in time of peace without the consent of the legislature. I call them unnecessary because the reason which had introduced a similar provision into the English Bill of Rights is not applicable to any of the state constitutions. The power of raising armies at all under those constitutions can by no construction be deemed to reside anywhere else than in the legislatures themselves, and it was superfluous, if not absurd, to declare that a matter should not be done without the consent of a body which alone had the power of doing it." End quote. So what he's saying here is that the point of having this clause or this provision without the consent of the legislator is completely pointless, because we already have a clause saying the purse or the funding of the military goes to the power of the legislature anyway. There's really no point in having to consult with the legislature, because they're the ones that give the authority for it to be done to begin with. It's almost like having a double safeguard on something that doesn't need to be done, and then in doing that, it makes it much less expedient to, if you need to mobilize the military. I guess that's really the point here. That's the reason for having it's pretty much a trivial provision in Hamilton's eyes, in his view. So then he states next, and I quote, "Accordingly, in some of these constitutions, and among others in that of this state of New York, which has been justly celebrated both in Europe and America as one of the best forms of government established in this country, there is a total silence upon the subject," end quote. So what he means is there's a total silence upon the subject of restricting the legislature in their duties to regulate the military or allow the military to keep and raise armies. So there was two states that didn't allow this. I think it was North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Maybe he goes on to talk about the two states. No, I might have missed that part. I don't have the quote for that, but I think it was North Carolina and Pennsylvania. We've talked about it before in one of these preceding papers that we had. So then he goes on to state, and I quote, "It is remarkable that even in the two states which seem to have meditated an interdiction of military establishments in time of peace, the mode of expression made use of is rather cautionary than prohibitory. It is not said that standing armies shall not be kept up, but that they ought not to be kept up in time of peace." End quote. So that is, he's bringing it all together. Is we're not talking about, like, for example, when you look at the Second Amendment, it is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the very end of that the very ending clause is shall not be infringed. So there should be no type of encroachments from the government, no type of infringement on that right, no type of regulation of that right. And that's debatable. People don't like the idea of me saying there shall not be, it shall not be infringed, the Second Amendment. So that's actually considered now something that's a constitutional power of the people that's enshrined in the Second Amendment is now considered a highly contested part of our Constitution. But so what he's saying is there's no type of legislation, even in these two individual states that do like the idea of restricting the legislature, it still does not say shall not be kept up. It just says ought not to be. So it's almost like a provision or a caution rather than an actual straight up prohibition of it. So then he continues on this note, and I quote, "Let us examine whether there be any comparison in point of efficacy between the provision alluded to and that which is contained in the new Constitution for restraining the appropriations of money for military purposes to the period of 2 years. The former, by aiming at too much, is calculated to effect nothing. The latter, by steering clear of an imprudent extreme and by being perfectly compatible with a proper provision for the exigencies of the nation, will have a salutary and powerful operation." End quote. So what he's talking about is when he talks about the former, he's talking about the appropriation of the funds. He's talking about the former when he's talking about the restricting of the legislature, saying, you need to keep troops, you need the authority of the legislature, you have to have their approval to do so. And the second part, and by having that in and of itself, by already having the purse, the military funding coming through the House of Representatives and through the Senate, coming through the legislative branch, that is much safer. It's much more expedient. If you have that provision alone, there's no point in having the first provision, because approving the military budget is approving the keeping and raising of troops to begin with. It's just more broad spectrum. Now, having that additional keeping troops on there is pretty much a trivial pursuit, and it's meaningless. It affects nothing. And so he thinks there's no reason to really put that in there, that provision in the Constitution. He thinks it doesn't really make any sense to have it, which makes sense. I mean, the way in which we do things now is, from what I just saw in the news, it looks like Trump just signed the funding bill, which I don't know how much longer it's going to keep our government funded. I think it's 1.4 trillion, and then you have the 900 billion on top of that. That's the COVID relief. They were holding Trump to the fire over this because people were going to be getting laid off. And then once he was requesting the 2,000, I'm not exactly sure. I wasn't reading into what has happened recently. The House of Representatives, the Republicans apparently turned it down, which doesn't really make sense because the Republicans actually don't hold the majority in the House of Representatives, so there must have been some Democrats that must have agreed with them. I'm not really sure. I have not read the story yet, so don't bet on what I'm saying here. But so then they politically, this is all political, all this stuff. So his political move is, it's Trump's fault. You're gonna have a bunch of people that are getting laid off. So then Trump goes, he signs, he proves that he caved to the political pressure instead of vetoing it or waiting it out, because apparently if he waited out so many days, then there would be a switch over to a new House of Representatives and they would have had to write up a whole new bill. So Trump, I guess, is just saying, everybody's going to have to take the $600. I'm not exactly sure politically how that move's going to line up, but that's what's being done now. So what my point is here is, in the Constitution, it says every single 2 years the budget should be, written in. They got to agree on it. Now we don't even do 2-year budgets. At this point, we go every couple months. We just got an extension, 1.4 trillion. From what I understand, it's probably only a couple months. That's probably not even a full year, considering our budget is always more than 4 trillion over the last couple of years. So maybe this might be a 3-month-long, 4-month-long budget, and that's it. That just got approved. So if Trump wants to go crazy tyrannical somehow, and he wants to mobilize the troops and sit in the White House and say, I'm not leaving, he only has so long. The troops only have so much money left. It only lasts a couple months, and then after that, it's all over, really. I can't see that happening, but that's a hypothetical. So now we don't even approve budgets every 2 years. We just do whatever we can to keep it rolling. Usually it's maybe a year or two. It's never longer, though, than 2 years. And that's because it's constitutionality. It can't be. It restricts it from doing so. So then he continues here. And I quote, "The legislature of the United States will be obliged by this provision once at least in every 2 years to deliberate upon the propriety of keeping a military force on foot, to come to a new resolution on the point, and to declare their sense of the matter by a formal vote in the face of their constituents. They are not at liberty to vest in the executive department permanent funds for the support of an army." End quote. So that is a safeguard on the people, the individual rights of the citizens, the private rights of the citizens, because they are not at liberty to vest the executive department with permanent funds to support an army. So they're not saying, we approve the military budget every 10 years. This is all done every single 2 years. And now in this current system we're seeing here, it's not even done every 2 years. It's done every couple months. It's done a year. We don't even know, because we're so inconsistent, because there's so much fighting going on in Congress between the two parties. So Hamilton continues by providing safeguards of a standing military, and this is where I'm going to get to the politics that's involved here. And I quote, "As the spirit of party in different degrees must be expected to infect all political bodies, there will be no doubt persons in the national legislature willing enough to arraign the measures and criminate the views of the majority." End quote. So here what he's saying, it's very cryptic, because he used the word criminate, majority, it's kind of confusing. What he's saying is there will always be people in the House of Representatives, or even in the Senate, of a minority party. When the majority is trying to become tyrannical, the minority party will be pointing this out to the people, and those are the constituents, those are the voters of these tyrannical or oppressive government officials, and they will quickly vote them out and get somebody else in there that is not willing to oppress the people. And that's really the point that's being made here. And then he continues on this note, and I quote, "The provision for the support of military force will always be a favorable topic for declamation. As often as the question comes forward, the public attention will be roused and attracted to the subject by the party in opposition, and if the majority should be really disposed to exceed the proper limits, the community will be warned of the danger and will have an opportunity of taking measures to guard against it." End quote. So that's exactly what he's saying, is exactly what I was saying before, is if they're exceeding the proper limits of military funding, the community will be warned of the danger, because there will be a minority party in the the legislature that will inform the public of this, and then the people themselves will have the opportunity of taking measures to guard against it, whether it is voting them out of office or to some sort of physical action. So it continues on this note, and I quote, independent of parties in the national legislature itself, as often as the period of discussion arrive, the state legislatures, who will always be not only vigilant, but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against encroachments from the federal government, will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers, and will be ready enough in anything improper appears to sound the alarm of the people, and not only to be the voice, but, if necessary, the arm of their discontent, end quote. This is important. I've mentioned this many, many times. The point of this Constitution is to have a lot of government officials deriving from the people, and then on top of that to also have multiple safeguards in the different branches against the oppression from the executive branch. You have the legislature to avoid that, or to battle against the oppression from an executive branch. And then you have the judicial branch that's supposed to protect your constitutional rights so that no government official can attempt to take away inalienable rights that are bestowed upon you by God. So then on top of all of that, then you also now have the state legislatures and the state governments in their own right, who are always going to be jealous of the power of the federal authority. They will be watching like hawks everything that they do. So if they take one step out of turn and they try to encroach or usurp their power, they will be one of the first people to sound the alarm to the people and let them know, and the people follow through with. They will be considered the arm of the discontent. They will be the physical action, whereas the state legislatures or the state officials will be the voice and to let the people know. They will warn or admonish the people. So then the Patriots during the Revolution were still able to win a battle against the strongest military with untethered power. Thus, the people should have nothing to fear from a national government that has more safeguards to a standing military provision, which really, I mean, it does make sense. The people and the militias, I mean, it wasn't just militias, but the people started with a militia, ended up having a continental army. They were able to win a battle against the strongest military power at the time and gain their independence. Thus, they really should not be that worried about a military power that is derived from the revenues of the people and derived from our own individual state governments and our state. Because you have the senators are derived from the state governments, the state legislatures, and then the House of Representatives are derived straight from the people. So, and the same thing, even the president to an extent is derived from the people as well. Not as democratically voted in, but very closely, more representatively voted in through a Republican system. So Hamilton contends, and I quote, schemes to subvert the liberties of a great community require time to mature them for execution. An army so large as seriously to menace those liberties could only be formed by progressive augmentations, which would suppose not merely a temporary combination between the legislature and executive, but a continued conspiracy for a series of time. Is it probable that such a combination would exist at all? ? End quote. So what he's saying here is this is actually relative to the time, things such as socialism or communism or an authoritarian regime. These things require time. They require time for the maturing of this execution. For it to be done, there needs to be maturing. It needs to be progressive. It is incremental. It is not something that is done all at one time. So this would have to happen over the years. You would have to see a continued oppression, a continued small teetering, little incremental movements, moving further and further towards oppression, further and further towards a military mobilization and takeover of the people. And that's what he's alluding to here, and it is similar to what's going on with progressivism, the far left. You have a small movement first. It was we'll do Obamacare. We're still not trying to get rid of private insurance. We'll never try to. And then suddenly now 4 years later, we are trying to get rid of private insurance. We want a government-free option of healthcare. Obamacare originally was supposed to just be a healthcare for people that were unemployed and didn't have it through their employer. Now it's almost like a supplemental program for people that had no healthcare. It still is not a fair system because then other people are paying for their healthcare. So it is still a social safety net system. It is a socialist program, but the attempt to implement it was not to get rid of that. The original intent to implement it was not to try to get rid of private insurers. Now what they want is a universal free option that would really jack up the premiums of private insurers and private health insurer holders more than anything, and it would just cause a mess. It would throw, I've said this before, it'll throw a wrench inorganically into our system that will cause inflation in prices. So these formats, these oppressive behaviors, these authoritarian moves are incremental. They require time. It is progressive, and it is, it does require time for it to happen. It's not something that happens overnight. So people will also, additionally, they'll be more aware of these progressive augmentations, is really what he's saying. And this would have to also happen combining the legislature and the executive. If you have an executive that's not tyrannical and the legislature that is, then the executive to a point can actually veto. He has a qualified negative to veto against it. And then you also have the judicial branch who can stop those type of unconstitutional movements from either branch, whether it's the executive or the legislative branch. So, in other words, progressive augmentations would be needed to take the liberties of the people and raise an oppressive army. By that time, the people would be at knowledge of this going on and this transpiring. So then he states, and I quote, "If such suppositions could even be reasonably made, still the concealment of the design for any duration would be impracticable. It would be announced by the very circumstance of augmenting the army to so great an extent in time of profound peace. What colorable reason could be assigned in a country so situated for such vast augmentations of the military force?" End quote. So what he's talking about is, why would we ever augment or increase the size of our military in times of peace when it's really not needed? People will be aware it is impracticable to expect people to just negligently live their life not paying attention or not being aware of what is going on. Now, at this time, this is pretty accurate. Right now, I don't really know. I think a lot of people do walk around. They have absolutely no clue what's going on with the government. They just kind of listen to whatever the mainstream media tells them, or whatever the celebrities and the legacy media tells them to think is what their opinions now become, or whatever memes they really read on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So Hamilton asserts, and I quote, "It is impossible that the people could be long deceived, and the destruction of the project and of the projectors would quickly follow the discovery," end quote. So when he's saying projectors, he's meaning state government officials, or even legislative officials in the federal government, or even it could even be the president if the president comes out and says, "Hey, the legislature is trying to usurp their power." So you're always going to have people willing to allude to the taking of liberties. So Hamilton concludes this paper by establishing the fears of hypotheticals of an army growing too large to necessitate this said hazard to liberty. And I'll explain this now. Hamilton follows that in the situation of large insurrections or to fight off a foreign invasion is the only time that we will see a military of the before stated magnitude. So this oppressive military structure, this vast military, the only time that we're going to see it is in situations of large insurrections and foreign invasions. So, and then he states, and I quote, "If we suppose it to have been created in consequence of some domestic insurrection or foreign war, then it becomes a case not within the principles of the objection, for this is leveled against the power of keeping up troops in time of peace. Few persons will be so visionary as seriously to contend that military forces ought not to be raised to quell a rebellion or resist an invasion." End quote. So he's saying the only time that it's ever going to get to that magnitude where it is considered a overly powerful standing army is if we have to quell insurrections, domestic insurrections, or we have a foreign war, like a foreign country is coming in, or we're going to fight a foreign war. So then Hamilton contends, and I quote, If the defense of the community under such circumstances should make it necessary to have an army so numerous as to hazard its liberty, this is one of those calamities for which there is neither preventative nor cure. It cannot be provided against by any possible form of government. It might even result from a simple league offense and defensive. If it should ever be necessary for the Confederates or Allies to form an army for common defense, end quote. So what he's saying is the only time that this is gonna this is going to arise, we really do not actually have. There is no cure for this, for having a standing military that we deem as too powerful during a domestic insurrection or a foreign war. You cannot form any more government to attempt to mitigate this. It won't make any difference. And the only thing that will, and he'll go on to explain this, the only thing that's going to inflame this and make this even more and more possible of happening, which in our history, I don't think we've really ever had domestic insurrections that were so large that we needed a large standing military. And foreign wars, we've never really had one either that was so large that we had this standing military that was willing, with the exception of maybe the Civil War. That might have been the only one when martial law was like really powerful over the people. But other than that, we've never really had any instance of this happening. And he explains why in his in the very last quote here, and he states, and I quote, "But it is an evil infinitely less likely to attend us in a united than in a disunited state. Nay, it may be safely asserted that it is an evil altogether unlikely to attend us in the latter situation. It is not easy to conceive a possibility that dangers so formidable can assail the whole Union as to demand a force considerable enough to place our liberties in the least jeopardy, especially if we take into our view the aid to be derived from the militia, which ought always to be counted upon as a valuable and powerful auxiliary, but in a state of disunion, as has been full shown in another place, the contrary of this supposition would become not only probable but almost unavoidable," end quote. So this is what he's explaining here. So having these individual confederacies, this disunited state, you are going to be infinitely more likely to have these standing militaries that are oppressive and far too powerful, and that's because of having that disunited state will cause more infighting between the states, not having that union. Therefore, you're going to have to build up the military powers. It is very similar to what was going on in, I think that was not the Danish Republic. I'm trying to think of which republic it was. If it was the Poland Republic, I think it might have been the Poland Republic. But the feudalism structure. I'm trying to think if maybe it was France, but whatever. It's very similar to the feudalism structure, where you have these nobles, these individual nobles that are going to build up their troops, build up their people, and they're going to fight against each other. And if you're the monarch, you're standing there watching. And in other words, if you're the executive, let's say you're the federal government, you're sitting there watching these states fight each other, and you go, okay, well, we need to build up our troops so we can quell an insurrection. We could stop all these individual nobles from taking over their lands. It's the same similar situation here, is that these disunited states, you're going to need a stronger federal military to quell the individual fights that are going on between the states, thus causing more instability, more disunion between the states. And in a union, you're not going to have that problem, because you're not going to have individual states fighting each other to begin with, because we all are in a union and we have a federal military that'll be able to handle any of those problems. And then on top of that, he states at the very end, he talks about how the militia will always be a valuable, powerful auxiliary. So he talks about keeping up troops, but they're not going to be so infinite. They're going to be much smaller than you think they're going to be. And if a problem actually ever arises and we don't have enough troops, that will be the reason for having the militia there as a backup. It will be a auxiliary to the troops, to the military. So in other words, he's stating here, an army of this magnitude, if achieved, will more than likely damage liberties in a disunited state rather than a united states. Additionally, to curtail a so numerous army is impossible because of the necessity of a vast army in war. Self-preservation supersedes the idea of the absence of a standing military in this respect. Lastly, like I said, Hamilton talks about the militia and how it'll be utilized as a valuable and powerful auxiliary. So here what he's saying before this, he says that, in other words, self-preservation of the Union, keeping the country America and not, the colonies or, the Nazi states of America or what have you, whatever war we had, or the Confederate States of America. In order to keep that self-preservation, which is always paramount over everything else, we need to have this standing military. And even if this standing military may at certain times get too large, we still need it, because it is essential, it is imperative for us, our self-preservation, which is paramount over everything. So that concludes this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe if you like the content. Make sure you drop the mic, let people know about the podcast. Today is Wednesday. I will see everybody on Friday. Thank you.